much for joining me.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
You haven't been diagnosed that long, correct?
No, it's been about 3 years now.
Oh, okay. So that's longer than I thought. Okay, so I'd love to hear, what was happening. It sounds like we were probably diagnosed around the same. I call myself a pandemic diagnosis. I don't know about you, but it sounds like, what was happening in your life really that at the time where you started to put two and two together and think, okay, this is really starting to explain a lot.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, for me, it's a pretty funny story, but, or ironic funny. I don't know. I find humor in, in all of this. My children, both around grade five, and my children are 17 and 24 now. So it was a minute ago. The teachers said that they thought they had ADHD, and I brushed it off because I have a cousin who has ADHD, and he was just off the chart with the impulsivity and just that class clown and that typical, stereotypical 6 year old little boy that you think of, just bouncing off the wall. So when they teachers told me that they thought my kids had it, I completely brushed it off. And my children always had problems with relationships and being, that too much rhetoric that you hear, from a lot of kids who have ADHD. And so my daughter actually sought out formal diagnosis. And once she did, I started wanting to learn more about ADHD. And so I took a deep dive and started reading, and a lot of the boxes were checked internally for the past probably 5 years before my diagnosis. I noticed that I was becoming really forgetful, and conversations that were had that I should have remembered, I didn't remember. The carelessness of forgetting my keys or double booking myself. And so I really went inward with it and started thinking that I had early onset dementia or Alzheimer's. And it was really scary because I didn't share it with anybody. It was just something that internally I was like, oh my goodness, of anything to lose, I don't want to lose who I am, my sense of self, or memories that, are so precious to me. And so when I found out that I have ADHD, I was hugely relieved in the beginning. And then I went through this mourning period of, oh, I've had so many jobs and I've had trouble too in relationships, and oh my goodness, RSD. Like, thank goodness it's a thing, but it really did destroy my psyche for a long time because I felt everything so big. And my emotional dysregulation manifests as, being a little bit more of a crybaby and holding on to things, not being able to let things go. So, once I went through the, whew, it's not Alzheimer's, to, oh gosh, this is why my life was so hard, then it was okay. If I can chalk this up to being about my ADHD and not this deficit in who I am as a human being, but a neurological condition, it was actually a pretty big relief. And it got me starting to seek community with other ADHDers. And any lifelong friendships I've had, which have a handful, all ADHD people.
Right?
So it's kind of funny. Like, we see each other just in a way, right? And it comes down to like validation. So, I've had a few careers. I've always been very career driven, hyper focused on different fields in sales and mortgage brokering, and then now ADHD mindset coaching. And a lot of friends who are neurotypical would almost judge me and make me feel bad. Oh, you're doing something else again, but you were so good at this. And of course, I was just chasing the dopamine. But my ADHD friends, they're like, this is awesome. They're my cheerleaders. They were the ones pumping
Mm.
my tires when I was like, oh, I want to try this new thing. I'm not sure. And they're like, oh, no, go for it. You're good at everything you do. So it's really neat how, the binary that society has for neurotypical people, ADHDers really can feel outside of that at times. So yeah, actually don't even remember what your original question was. I went on a very, very much an ADHD tangent. So
I really like the term pumping my tires. I don't think I've heard that before. In terms of just supporting you, right? And it's true. Like, you just reminded me of how tired I used to get of telling people what I was doing, right? Like, especially like my husband's family, like I just nobody could keep up with what school I was in or what certification I was chasing or what job I was in. And there was sort of this like inherent eye roll that I always felt, or at least internalized, around all of these different jobs and passions, and I always felt so much shame about I've joked about this on the podcast, this drawer I have of business cards that I would buy a whole box of business cards and maybe hand out five, and then next thing I knew I was onto something else, and it felt like this was this drawer of shame for me. And now I'm like, no, all of these things have led to where I am today. Like, yeah. Oh, wow. So how was that conversation with your daughter when she was diagnosed, where you were sort of like, oh gosh, because, we talk a lot about the grief in our own life, looking back,
Mm.
and nobody knew, nobody saw the signs. But what was it like sort of to go through that with your own life, but then also with your daughter and having that conversation about, gosh, like I had, we didn't know, right? Like we just didn't
Yeah.
know.
It it was really humbling because um, I the guilt that I have over not knowing that my children have ADHD is that I supported the don't be too much rhetoric that so many of us struggle with growing up in adolescence. And so my daughter, oh, she's just such a vivacious human being. She would be twirling around in the mall as a little girl, and I'd be like, calm down, calm
Mm.
down. And if I could take something back, that's what it would be. My father also has ADHD. It was never formally diagnosed, but he really did not handle his ADHD in a way that makes ADHDers proud to have ADHD. He was on the streets a lot and went to a life of drugs. So I mean, literally my childhood was the blind leading the blind, and then having two children with ADHD and not knowing how to parent because I was never given the opportunity to be around good role models. It was chaos. So I mean, the emotional dysregulation and me flying off the handle and maybe raising my voice when I shouldn't, the not letting go of things, the trying to uh, make my children fit into a binary that wasn't natural to them. I hold a lot of guilt around that. And so now moving forward, I validate and I just remind them every day that although I did the best that I could, I really got it wrong. And knowledge is power. And I just think my daughter, especially, she's a little bit older, is so amazing. Like she's done so much therapy. She's embraced treating her ADHD, and she is going to break the cycle of the generational trauma of undiagnosed ADHD because whenever she decides to have children, she just has so much more in her toolbox than I ever had. And I really admire and respect that.
Mm. Yeah, that's so well said. Yeah, my daughter is only 16, but I so appreciate how she approaches things without shame. And so, right, and so I do have to take some credit for that as her parent. Just, in the way that we are disrupting these cycles. But I think also just like she teaches me so much, right? I think it just brings, I think this whole self-identity journey with ADHD diagnosis is just, I feel like there is a lot of that like grace and forgiveness that we have to have not only with each other but with ourselves. And I just so appreciate how much my daughter like calls me out on things. If she's like
Yeah.
tells me I'm sounding too much like a boomer or something like I love one of the dynamics I love about parenting as my kids get older is how reciprocal that relationship is, right? Because for so
Hmm.
long when they're younger, it's so much more top down, and I don't know, I really love it, and I'm kind of grateful for being. I think that being neurodivergent allows us to really have a lot more flexibility and open-mindedness. Like I think a lot of our natural curiosity really benefits us as parents, where we are able to really kind of see things from fresh perspectives and adapt, and in ways that I think are so beneficial for our children. I just think ADHD people are like such fantastic parents if we can believe it in ourselves.
Yeah. And that's really where my whole life journey has taken me is just always struggling with my own self-concept and second guessing myself, and just knowing that now that I know that I have ADHD, I can't necessarily control the executive dysfunctions that come. I mean, I can do things like diet and, medication and cold shower therapy. And there's, a ton of things that you can do to try to mitigate the isms of ADHD that aren't as sexy. But it just really comes down to, especially with our kids, like just I admire this next generation so much. I think, the boomers, whether or not they're getting a bad rap right now, it kind of seems to be the case just with how narrow-minded, the mental health field was at the time. And then we're that kind of generation that had to pay for it, but also needs to wake up a little bit. And then our kids, they get it. And I love the way the young people are taking us, because I really think that they are pioneering something that's really going to give us that finality to that shift with mental health and being okay within your own skin, and, not seeing ADHD as this deficit of who you are as a human being and what you bring to the table, but what you can be that's outside of the neurotypical binary. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I know, right? I feel like my children wear their diagnosis with a badge of honor. And again, I sort of feel like I have to take some credit for that in terms of how the conversation, how we talk about ADHD. And I'm certainly not, ADHD is a superpower kind of person, but I think we talk about it like it is something fantastic too, that also, needs a lot of support and management and understanding. And like you said, information is power. Now, how your son is also diagnosed, I take it.
Yeah.
And he's at a really like pivotal stage too, right? Is he going to university or?
He just graduated. He had an early graduation in January, and we're going to be going to his grad here in the next couple of weeks. He's really come into his own in the past year with, working and a really nice girlfriend. And I think that something that ADHDers can fall into that maybe isn't always good is we have this innate desire to be accepted. And so I'm really grateful that the person who he's chosen to spend his time with currently is someone who's a really good influence. And, I think it's helped him grow as a person, being around someone who's a really hard worker and also neurodivergent. And so, yeah, I mean, it's been really, really good. But, the teenage years are hard for ADHDers because the hormones are racing and the emotional dysregulation is a thing, right? So I think puberty really hits ADHDers harder. Also perimenopause, which is what I feel like I'm in right now. And that's kind of when you're like, oh yeah, hello ADHD. Time to do a little bit more meditating and a little bit more self-care, because it's a lot to manage when you're not practicing mindfulness and you're not, able to step back and take perspective.
Well, I think it's such a hard age too, because there's so, having an interest-based nervous system, like you're so you're so torn between what you want to do and what you should do, right? And there's so many overwhelming shoulds as you enter into adulthood, of all these things where it's like, if you don't take this path, you're going to ruin your life, right? Like there's such a sense of bigness to a lot of decisions at that age that I remember just feeling so overwhelmed, and obviously was not, had no idea anything about ADHD at the time, but just like, just in terms of, I dropped out of university, like, and because I was like, why am I here? Like all of those really big questions about why am I doing stuff. I think when you are neurodivergent, like you really have to connect deeply with your why. And that's really hard when you're young, right? Like, who knows? I don't know why I'm doing a lot of the things when I, when I was that age.
Yeah. I think that's why, like, when we are, trying to encourage our kids to connect with their why, the second layer to that is your why doesn't have to stay where it is. You're allowed to pivot. I mean, I've had many different jobs, and now where I'm sitting, where I am, I can see how each one of them gave me a certain aspect of strength to what I'm doing right now. Part of that is just even talking to you. I have tremendous social anxiety. I'm actually also on the autism spectrum disorder. And so doing these kinds of things, and my time in real estate, for example, it really forced me to step out of my comfort zone and start being more personable, because I have like this innate desire to be sociable, but then I also have this anxiety that pairs with it, for like, but I don't really want to put myself up. I do, but I don't. It's this tug of war that I play with myself.
Yeah, right. I think a lot of us have that. We talk a lot about the am I an introvert, am I an extrovert question, because there are some situations where I feel absolutely extroverted in the fact that I love interviewing new people, right? Like I love in meeting you and having this podcast and having all of these experiences where I feel so fulfilled and so nourished by other people. But then at the same time, so many social situations that give me, yeah, like intense anxiety and feeling very much like, grocery stores and running into people and all of the, every time my phone rings, like all of these weird random situations where I'm like, where do I put that in terms of my relationships? I don't know, buffet, but no, no. Were you diagnosed with autism at the same time as ADHD, or was that a
No,
later?
just about 6 months ago, I went through Embrace Autism to pay for a private diagnosis, just because, I mean, my whole mission is just to understand myself more. And I started, on LinkedIn. That's kind of where my biggest following is at the moment. I, started noticing that a lot of people have autism and ADHD, and reading posts and going, oh, well, I mean, I kind of have that too. And it's interesting. I don't know as much about autism as I know about ADHD, but it's interesting that people who are ADHD, the ADHD fights the autism. It's very strange. So I'll have an ism about me, and I'm like, okay, is this an ADHD thing? Is this an autism thing? Is this a nurture thing? So
Is this a
it's
menopause thing? Is
it's
this
is this a,
a
yeah,
angry
exactly.
feminist thing? Is that right? I feel like
Yeah,
that's this whole podcast is me being like, what is this? What are we talking about here?
absolutely.
But you're right. There are so many ways in which there are these paradoxes, especially around need for structure and demand avoidance demand avoidance versus accountability, and like all of those ways in which we are just so chaotic inside. And
Yeah.
actually, one of the ones that I think leads to, so many of us, especially so many ADHD, so many of us are diagnosed well ahead of our diagnoses with depression and anxiety, right? And so I
Mhm.
think, one of the themes I explore a lot in this podcast too, because of my own life, was self-esteem and anxiety and depression, and like, was I depressed? What caused the depression? I feel like very angry sometimes at how clinicians often talk about depression and anxiety like they just exist, and like you just sort of caught them like you caught a cold. Like they don't really have a lot of curiosity as to what's the underlying trauma behind some of this stuff. And as we, so many of us have traumatic pasts, and so where does that fit in with our behaviors and our traits? I'm getting off topic, sorry. So anyway, but one of the things when we were talking about paradoxes was this feeling of like, I often felt, and I would often talk about this with my therapist, like, I can't decide if I have high self esteem or low self esteem, because many times I would feel like a perfectionist. I was very much like, I need to be the one in charge. I have to do everything. And I'm the only one who can do this. And I'm smart, honestly, just smarter than everyone else. Like, I always felt like I was smarter than people, but at the same time, also feeling very, very dumb and feeling very much like like we talk about, like feeling like I'm masking and that people don't, that I'm fooling people. And I never could really put my finger on what that was. And she was always sort of, we would talk about the difference between self-esteem and maybe like self-respect or dignity. But I feel like it's a concept a lot of us seem to have shared before our diagnoses, which is this like real, dual personality, this split personality between like, am I really, really smart, or am I really, really dumb? And how do I relate to people around me?
Yeah, and that was one of my biggest paradigms, years ago, especially in my 30s before I went to university, was this paradigm that I wasn't smart enough. I always struggled in school. I've never been diagnosed with dyslexia or dyscalculia, but I have definitely struggled in learning and in learning environments and how they're structured, and really, starting to challenge those blanket statements. And I think that's something that a lot of ADHDers fall into is we live in our heads a lot, and we really do make these grandiose blanket statements, and that can keep us stuck. And that's where, we really need to, the emotional part of our brain is beautiful because we're highly empathetic and all of the things, but then also the emotional part of our brain really gets us in trouble because we can ruminate on the negative. We do have a tendency to be more rigid in our thinking and how we see the world, and then that leads to missed opportunities and lower self-esteem and all of the things, right? So I can totally relate to everything you're saying. Like, I don't know if this is being videotaped where we're going to be on a screen somewhere, but like every time you talk, I'm just like nodding, yes, 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 yes. Oh my gosh, yes. And I absolutely struggled with anxiety and depression for, most of my adult life. And I still fall into that very, very easily if I'm not careful. And I had a very unhealthy relationship with alcohol for a long time. So to learn after I had ADHD that, women with ADHD have a 13% more likely chance to fall into addiction than someone who's neurotypical, it was beautiful to learn that because it was it was something that once my alcohol addiction was no longer controlling my life, I could step back and give myself some grace. And I think that that's something that so many people with ADHD struggle with, is giving themselves grace and realizing that ADHD, whether you want to call it a superpower or not, it is a neurological condition that's highly hereditary, and it is a disability. You don't have to walk around like you're disabled and wear this, oh my goodness, like I have ADHD, so I need a hall pass for all the things. But at the end of the day, it is a disability. And the only reason it's a disability is because the neurotypical standard is outside of what comes easy for us. And I think that if society was all neurodivergent, then the neurotypicals would have a disability. And that's where, podcasts like yours and what you're doing and spreading the word of ADHD and normalizing it and humanizing it for so many, specifically women who are late diagnosed, can make us feel like we're not alone on this island anymore. Because I spent my entire life feeling like I was the only one who was too much or not enough or lazy or everything in between. And it's no wonder that so many people with ADHD struggle with anxiety and depression when they're constantly being told this about you and this about you and this about you. And I'm sure that you know this stat, and if I have it wrong, please correct me. By age 10, the average child with ADHD has heard 20,000 pieces of negative feedback. And I can attest from my own childhood and the parent-teacher interviews that I went to for my kids that that's true. That's 100% bang on true. I mean, I don't know if the number is accurate, but we do hear a lot more. So how does that affect our psyche? It's so natural to me that so many of us would have depression and anxiety. Depression because we're sick of being put down and we're believing it, and anxiety because we're scared to speak up because every time we do, we're being judged or pointed at. I mean, and of course, I'm being grandiose in saying this, but like, it just makes sense to me. It totally makes sense to me. And I obviously don't understand neuroscience, but I mean, 1 + 1 = 2. So to me, that it just really makes sense.
Yeah. The other thing that was really eye-opening to me was the concept of the default mode network too, and just how much we focus on the negative because it's more interesting. It's literally more interesting for our brains, and how difficult it is for us to like celebrate wins, right? Because we're always moving on to the next win. The win for us is in the struggle, is in the pushing the boulder up the hill. The win is never the celebration after the fact. And so because we spend so little time in reflection and celebration mode, I think it also speaks to how many of us are chronically depressed as a result.
Yeah.
And that was really fascinating to me. It was just that idea that like focusing on the negative is quite simply more interesting for us. And I think that's really certainly influenced kind of my way of thinking, and how I actively have to think about what is good in my life and what I'm grateful for and what I bring to the table and all of those things. It's not going to naturally come to me. I have to work at it like anything else.
Hmm. Absolutely. It's a muscle you have to practice, right? That's the essence of neuroplasticity is your brain is going to take the path of least resistance, and drama produces just as much dopamine as anything else. And that is, I think, definitely why we go to that is because, we're chasing that dopamine constantly. And we don't
Hmm.
care where we get it from. I mean, we
Yeah, right.
do, but subconsciously we don't, right? We do.
No, I'm fascinated about neuroencoding. That's something I hadn't heard of, and you are a specialist in that. So, can you tell me a little bit more about what neuroencoding is and how that combines with your own approach to coaching?
Uh, it was just developed as a form of neuroplasticity for someone like a life coach to be able to take. So it's a very short program. I don't know if it's an accredited program like an ICF designation. I also have a life and health coaching certificate. But basically, it just kind of breaks down how, whatever you're focusing on the most expands. And so neuroencoding teaches, certain pillars to focus on so that you can move that needle in the right direction. Because I'm a firm believer that there's so many things with ADHD that we can't fully control. But one thing that we can practice to and learn how to control is how we perceive things. And the example that I use often with my clients or just in conversation is if you've ever seen a fly trying to get out of a window, and from where you're sitting, you can see that there's an opening to get out of the window if that fly would just back up a little bit. And yet it's batting its body against the window and it cannot get out and it's tirelessly trying to get out. And so if we try to, make a parody to that, say rejection sensitivity dysphoria or emotional dysregulation, our brain doesn't have the default button to back up and take perspective. And that's why practicing mindfulness is so important because, you know, um, impulsivity is something that we struggle with. So I don't know about you, but I've definitely had RSD moments and then sent a message and been like, oh crap, why did I do that? I really jumped the gun. I got really sensitive. And so, learning about things like the power of the pause, and that's just what I call it. Other people have, different names for it. Is just, okay, before something happens where you're reactive, take 24-hour space. And that forces us, instead of going to our default where we want to be reactive because we do struggle with impulsivity, to step back to see if there's another point of view. But we need to take that space. And practicing mindfulness is when your default wants you to do something, but you're able to stop and be present enough to say, okay, I cannot go to this default reaction right now. I need to take a little bit of perspective. So long answer short, it's really just about learning what we focus on expands, whatever it is. And the only way to really see other ways out of things for us as ADHDers is to stop and think about it for a minute first. And that's something that's very teachable.
Yeah, I was just going to say it is teachable. But it's also not naturally something we're good at.
No.
Paying attention is not something we're very good at. Yeah, it really is. I always feel, and I'm sure you get this as an ADHD coach too, right? I feel like so many of my clients are like, I was diagnosed. Now I know what's wrong with me. Fix me. Right. And my job is to really unpack that and okay, I'm like, there's nothing to fix, right? Like, this is really
No.
about how we are able to reframe who we are and in how we live in the world. And sometimes I feel like people will be like, well, it's easy for you to say, you've got it all together and you've figured it all out and I'm a hot mess. And I'm like, no, we're all hot messes. I don't have it. I'm like, there's no secret sauce that's out there that's like, oh, and it really bothers me when there are ADHD coaches out there who kind of play up that rhetoric that it's like, work with me and I'm going to reveal this secret strategy that we all know that you don't know, right? Because I think it's really like, it really preys on that mindset that so many of us have had our whole life, which is the answers out there, the answers at the end of the next self-help book, right? The answer is like at the end of this course. And I really like rail against that idea that there's some secret solution out there that but at the same time, um, do feel like, if there is a secret sauce, it is how we are able to kind of step back and reframe a lot of how we thought we viewed life, and why this diagnosis can be so incredibly transformative for so many of us. It's not that there's some secret, that there's not some secret planner out there that we all get when we get our diagnosis that makes us no
Yeah.
longer a shit show. But it's the fact that it's like, yeah, I am a shit show. So what, right? Like, what am I going to do with that information? I think is the next step.
Right. And, just the acceptance. Like, okay, so, and I just love that you say shit show because I have said that about myself. But what is a standard of a shit show? Like, where the neurotypical peanut gallery really, has defined that because I do something in a certain way, I'm a shit show.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm brave. I think that I'm creative. I think that um, the mistakes that I've made and me still standing here and not on the floor shows that I'm resilient. Like, I've been through a lot of things and, probably a little bit more than the average person because I have a lot of childhood trauma and a dual diagnosis on top of it, but I'm still standing. I don't have an unhealthy relationship with alcohol anymore. I am okay not being liked or accepted. If I'm too much for you, go find less. I can't remember who said that, some TikTok, Alyssa something. Uh, like that is okay. I'm okay now not having everyone like me. My true fans, the people who get me and appreciate me, I'd way rather have a group of 5 or 10 really, really close people who see me and accept me than to be the most popular girl in the world and have them all snickering behind my back, but I'm oblivious to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that might be
Yeah.
a getting old thing as well. I don't want
Right.
more
Well,
comfortable in my skin.
and I do think that that's probably why many women are diagnosed at a certain age, right? As we are kind of approaching perimenopause. And, sometimes it's the catalyst is typing in like early onset dementia into Google and then starting the journey that way. But I think there is something to be said about just like reaching that age where you're just like, I don't give a shit anymore. Like, I'm sorry, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm not masking. I'm not living by anyone else's rules. Like, I think we do reach that metaphorical breaking point, in our 40s. If we're, hopefully we reach it in our 20s like your daughter did. But in some ways, I think a lot of us do come to our diagnosis from that, of just that, like, I can't do it anymore. I'm not doing it anymore. So yeah.
Absolutely.
It was Elise Myers too, by the way. I was
Elise
like, it
Myers.
just
Oh
it
my
just occurred
goodness.
to me
I just
as
love
you were.
her.
I know she's amazing. Oh my God, she's amazing. She would be my dream guest, but she looks like she's a little busy.
Well, if ever I blow up, which I don't plan on it, and I have a connection to her, I'll make sure she comes your way, 100%.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Sarah. Um, so now, I mean, gosh, what do I want to ask now? I'd love to know kind of how you got into ADHD coaching, because I assume you were a coach before your diagnosis. That's what I had. I sort of pivoted from health coaching into ADHD coaching as I realized how interconnected they all were. But I'd love to know a little bit more about your business and the mindset coaching. I know you have a mastery course, right?
Hmm. Yeah, for me, it's very much my story. I struggled with anxiety and depression for so many years. And so I am that ADHDer who took that deep dive into learning about mindfulness, everything from the esoteric type teachings like Eckhart Tolle and, Alan Watts to, Tony Robbins and, Jay Shetty and all of the things. And I really just found that mainstream mindfulness, which is obviously such a blanket even term to use, is very ableist to an ADHDer. It is absolutely true that happiness from within needs to happen before all the good things happen, before, because we're all horses with blinders on, and whatever we believe and think is going to expand. And so when I took this deep dive, I'm like, geez, they're telling me to just be happy and everything else will come together, but I'm on the floor. Like, how do I get from A to B? Because
Mm.
it seems impossible. Visualization. I actually have aphantasia, so I cannot visualize. I close my eyes and I see black. That was very frustrating to me. And so when I took my coaching credentials for the life and the health coaching certificate, I found that the coaching practices that they were teaching me were very much the same. And I'm like, it's still not hitting the mark for me. So when I decided to move into ADHD mindset coaching, and I don't have an ADHD coaching certificate specifically, but I'm not an executive function coach, I'm a mindset coach. I started out by interviewing 60 women, and then I reverse engineered the process based on what I know from my coaching practice, to all of the books that I read, and to my own experience as someone who struggled so much with anxiety and depression for so many years. And I built a program by reverse engineering it based on my own experience and the experience of the 60 women who I interviewed. And, we absolutely can go from being on the floor to confident and happy and self-assured, but our brains are different. We need content that is more interesting and shorter. Another thing that, is really important in my program, I'm sure you do similar things in your practice, is I use a lot of worksheets because our brains, because of our ADHD and our executive dysfunction, we don't always have the capability to take perspective on things. And so I love pen to paper. So for example, one aspect of my program is a paradigm makeover, where you write down your biggest blanket statement. Mine happened to be, I'm not smart because I didn't do well in school. And then you really challenge that by disproving that theory with all the evidence of the things that did make me smart. And right there, that was an opportunity for me to get out of my emotional brain and to use a little bit of logic, and maybe the autism in me, I very much like systems and processes, to write that down. And so when I was able to do that for myself, to see that, yes, my default is definitely still anxiety and depression. It's very easy for me to fall into. I had, 35 years of it. It's super easy to be negative. But I knew that if I could figure out an ADHD friendly way to get myself out of that funk, that other women were struggling with it as well, and I could get them out of that funk. And it all comes down to the BS that we tell ourselves, right? We absolutely have the executive dysfunction. We absolutely are never going to be doing backflips over doing our taxes or the dishes or whatever our thing is that, we are running away from. But then there's this extra layer that we add to it when we start beating ourselves up. And so my job as an ADHD coach and my purpose is, to teach people that you don't have to beat yourself up. You don't have to feel bad because you have ADHD. And adopting this mindset of progress over perfection, as long as you're moving the needle in the right direction, now all of a sudden you're just dealing with the executive dysfunctions. Okay, so let's figure out some open organization for you. Let's figure out how to take a grandiose task and maybe reverse engineer it or break it into small pieces or use a Pomodoro technique or, whatever else, the 30-minute time block technique or whatever else to get the stuff done. But at least you don't have that layer of, I'm not good enough, I'm too much, I'm lazy, nobody likes me, I don't like myself, I'm going to screw this up again. Because the bullshit that we tell ourselves adds an extra layer to keep us stuck. And so I very much wanted to create something because I knew it worked for me after so many years of alcoholism and debilitating depression and even at times, not wanting to be here ideology. I've been in the hole. Even in my 20s, I had a suicide attempt and had to get my stomach pumped. Like I've been in the hole, and women don't have to suffer like this. Like we don't have to suffer like this, and we don't have to continue to lie to ourselves, but you don't know what you don't know until someone shows you that you don't know it. And so I'm so passionate about this. I'm so passionate about this because we're never going to fix the chemistry of our brain. our delay in our prefrontal cortex, our, enlarged amygdala, and all of the other fancy words that I could, try and mispronounce. But we can fix and we can work on and we can nurture how we see ourselves and how we accept ourselves. And that absolutely by default changes your stance of how you show up in the world. Because people who don't have a high self-esteem, they don't put themselves out there. They have that Eeyore energy. People who have a high self-esteem and have self-love, they walk through the world with their shoulders back and their head up. And from an energetic perspective, you're going to attract a whole different life for yourself just by feeling better about yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's one of the things I love about Sari Solden's work, and how it was, so transformative for me, was just this simple statement that, you are worthy of support, and I think that we get so wrapped up in feeling like we have to figure everything out ourselves and we have to do everything ourselves, and that by the time we ask for help, asking for help is somehow an admission of failure, or it's giving up, or it means that we have, that we are terrible. And it's quite the opposite, like asking for help is sort of like the first thing I go to now. I'm like, how can I, if there's something I don't want to do or something I'm struggling with, I'm like, who can I get to do this for me? Who can I get to do this with me? Or like asking for help is absolutely, something I can do without shame now. And I think that was a huge shift for me. Thanks. And I credit Sari Solden's work for that, in terms of just really being, being drilled into my head that like you can be a phenomenal human being and also need a lot of support. And that's where I think looking at ADHD as a disability can be really helpful, which is like, I am worthy of support and I really need to ask for it, because this is not something I should do on my own or can do on my own.
Yeah. And I feel like that's also a perfect example of, you being a person in general being more self-assured. That is an element of having a higher self-esteem, is being okay with the fact that you might have some blind spots that you might need a little bit of guidance with. Mm-hmm. But when you're stuck and, you're not self-assured, you're struggle with your self-esteem, you're adding that whole extra layer of friction, because it's like, well, now if I ask for support, what if I'm judged? What if that makes me less than in the world? It can almost make you a little bit more meek. And I love her as well. She's amazing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if you could rename ADHD to something else, do you know what you would call it?
Oh my goodness. I love this.
I knew this was coming.
I knew this was coming. And a few months ago on LinkedIn, I did a post with, let's rename the acronym ADHD. So in keeping with the same acronym, mine is adventurous, dynamic, hero-like, and diligent.
That's awesome. I love when we can still keep the same acronym, because it'll be so much easier to Google and then we don't have to remember a new name. So, which is always my issue with FAST. That's awesome. I love that. Now, you'll have to send me a link to it, or I'll look it up. I'll put that in the episode show notes, the LinkedIn post. And I'll definitely put a link. I'll definitely put a link to your LinkedIn account, because you seems like that's where you're most active. But where can people find you and work with you and get more? You also have a YouTube channel, right?
I do. I just started a YouTube channel. That's been really, really a neat experience, and learning all of the, back end optimization with YouTube. So on YouTube, I'm Sara Kelly, ADHD Mindset Coach. And on LinkedIn, I am just Sara Kelly. And my website is www.adhdmastery.com. And the website leads to a link to sign up to a complimentary masterclass that talks about the 5 pillars to creating lasting change. And at the end of that masterclass, there is an opportunity to book a complimentary call with me to see if we would be a good fit for each other. My program is a 6-week program that can be done in 6 weeks with a lifetime membership. a supportive Facebook group, and weekly group coaching calls. And the reason that I've taken that route rather than the one-on-one coaching is, for one, to protect my energy. I cannot be talking to 10 people a day and
Mm-hmm.
keep my energy intact. And then the other reason is the ebbs and flows of life do not care about a 6-week program and it ending and you being booted out. And so I have a lifetime program. When my students are doing well and they're not showing up to calls, great. But if, 6 months later, some RSD comes and bites you in the butt and you need a little bit of support and some perspective to be given, then I'm still around.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. I love that you have kind of articulated that, because I find the group dynamic, especially with ADHD coaching, is just magical. And I love one-on-one coaching as well. But you're right, it's a totally different type of energy, and yeah, I love spending time in small group work. So yeah. Anyway, thank you so much, Sarah. It was lovely to hear your story, and yeah, I'll definitely make sure everybody can find all the links in the show notes to work with you and find out more about you and watch some of your awesome videos. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this.